today's webinar, and we are excited to welcome an excellent speaker here with us today, Mark Valentine. So Mark is the president of global government at Skydio, where he focuses on delivering intelligent drones to militaries and governments around the world. Previously, he led teams at Scale AI and Microsoft and served for over 25 years as a combat veteran fighter pilot, commander, and staff officer in the US Air Force. He holds a BS from the US Air Force Academy and an MA from Georgetown University. So we are certainly in great hands for this conversation today. And with that, Mark, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. Really appreciate the overly kind introduction. And welcome to everyone attending the webinar today. As stated, I am Mark Valentine. I wish I could see all of your faces, but I can't. But please, if you have questions, type those into the chat window, and we will definitely save time at the end of the event to get to as many of those as possible. So my plan for today is I think we have roughly 40 minutes. So I will probably transmit for 15 or 20 of those minutes. And then I would really like to spend another 20 minutes answering questions, because I think that is probably the most important. So we're here to talk about the transformative impact that drones, and obviously I work at Skydio, so I can emphasize and speak to more of how Skydio drones have impacted the frontline military operations. But to get there, I think we need to cover a few things first. So I will give you the bottom line up front, and I will say this again at the end. I see a future, based on what I'm seeing today, where there is a future battlefield where there are sensors everywhere, they are connected to everything, and they are informing everyone. So again, I will get to that later, and we will end with that same statement, but I wanted to put that up front, which should frame the rest of the comments. So again, we're here to talk about innovating and how drones are used with frontline military operations. So it's probably good at this point to take a quick step back and remind ourselves why military forces exist in the first place. And obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is close with, destroy, terms like that, fight, win. And those are all true, but I think those are subsets of what the broader idea of having military is, and that's ultimately to create peace. And in a perfect world, we create peace without ever having to fight. And to accomplish that, one side must have, or at least be perceived to have, the ability to impose such high costs on an adversary that they decide that aggression just simply is not worth it. And to put this in a single word, that's called deterrence. So deterrence is a function of many things, but at a high level, it's generally the capability to inflict damage and the will to use that. And so I think deterrence can also be thought of as a function of readiness. So when I think about my job at Skydio, and our support, we're a dual use company, but when we're supporting military forces, I really think of our job is to create the most effective, resilient, and reliable tools that we can, and provide those to US and allied militaries so we can actually prevent conflict. So in a weird way, I see deterrence as part of my job here at Skydio. And I think that's especially important right now, because I feel like we're at an inflection point, if you will, in human history, where just turn on the news today or whatever your news source is, there's conflict just about everywhere you look around the world. Obviously, you've got the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I just came back from Ukraine last week, and I can tell you there's an active armed conflict going on in Eastern Europe. I think everyone sees what's going on in the Middle East, but there are also skirmishes and aggressive actions going on around the world, Central Asia, Latin America, and then, of course, there's the threat of the Ukraine-Russia war expanding throughout Europe, and then this burgeoning competition, which may become a conflict in East Asia. And these last two in particular raise the specter of potentially another world war. And it's very disconcerting, and it makes one wonder, why is this happening now? And if you actually go back and talk to military strategists or read military history, people who study conflict and conflict resolution, in general, the thought is that wars really happen for one reason, and that's because deterrence fails. And if we wonder, why is deterrence failing? It appears to me that at this time, a lot of deterrence is failing because many of the strategic paradigms upon which we built that deterrence, they're kind of stuck in the past. And this is either because there's tons of massive miscalculation around the world, or aggressors are maybe accurately assessing that many nations won't risk many of their high-end, exquisite, or expensive weapon systems in order to achieve their aims. And so this is where, the critical call for innovation, I think, is important, because I think drones, and especially small uncrewed aerial systems or small UAS, actually are starting to change some of the strategic calculus. And I think this is good for the world. So before we get there, I think to understand why we are where we are today, we probably need to go back and look at how small UAS are changing battlefield tactics and understand a little bit of the history. I do think that's important. And we all know powered flight's been around since 1903. And since 1903, there have been tons of examples of remotely piloted vehicles and aircraft being flown without humans in them. But really, in the defense context, I think the history of UAS in particular starts about a quarter century ago, or right after 9/11, when the US started to use the RQ-1, which was called the Predator, in their campaign in Afghanistan. And they were using the RQ-1 in what's called an ISR, or an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance role. And the idea was to put a persistent eye in the sky that could stay airborne for a long time, high resolution, provide a great feed of full motion video back to a command center so humans can make better decisions. And that persistence was important. And you could also, because there was not a human in that aircraft, put it into more dangerous situations than you might be willing to put a human. And I think this makes sense when you look at how drones or small UAS are used around the world. Typically speaking, we're talking about putting a sensor in a place where we don't want to put a human, whether it's too dangerous to put a human there, too drudgerous, or it's just not economical to do so. So the military started doing that roughly right after 9/11, and these systems were used to great effect. They really, really changed the nature of, especially tactics at the time, on how the US was fighting the war in Afghanistan. The problem was these systems were still really, really large. It took several C-17s of logistics capacity to move over the air vehicle itself, the launch and recovery crew, all of the computers. And these expensive systems also required a very, very large group of specially trained humans to operate and support that equipment. And so while it looked like, hey, these things are uncrewed, as a matter of fact, the US Air Force stopped calling them unmanned aerial systems at the time, and specifically started using the words RPV, or remotely piloted vehicle, because they did not want to imply that these things didn't have a large trail of humans that it took to support and operate them. And if you look at over the next decade or two, since 9/11, those systems got smaller. So they went from 29 feet in length and wingspan down to maybe 10-ish or so. But they were still relatively large. And while they were relatively cheap in terms of US defense dollars, these things still cost millions of dollars to procure, and then many, many more millions of dollars to train the operators and actually operate them in combat. And so the systems were great for the contemporary conflicts that were going on in the Middle East, which were primarily in a counterterrorism role. But somewhere around 2009 through 2012, the strategic calculus started to change, and our leaders started to recognize that maybe there was a larger threat out there. And this idea of competing once again with near peer competitors, which was really a code word for Russia, China, et cetera, that started to become a larger strategic challenge than those counterterrorism days that we had been facing for the last decade or so. And so military theorists started looking at the options, and they said, hey, maybe these things that are working well in a counterterrorism type operation might not be the best choice in this larger conflict against a near peer competitor. And this led a group of military strategists to really start considering what many called a hedging strategy, which, instead of focusing on a small number of very, very capable, but also very, very expensive things, started to shift their thinking and go, perhaps a better way to do this is to focus on a large number of small things that are also inexpensive, and so we're not afraid to lose them. And if you go back to military strategy, you might see something called an exchange ratio, which is essentially the cost of something that you might lose to the cost of something that would take it down. And so this strategy became known by many as the small the many, and the agile. And the first person I heard say that was Admiral Lauren Selby, who's the personal friend and also the former chief of naval research. And so this small, mini, agile strategy really started being discussed more and more. And then by the late 2010s, the United States military said, yes, we at least want to explore and investigate this area. And they turned to the private sector and commercial off-the-shelf technology to support this small, mini, and agile strategy. And the initial goal was to provide organic or dedicated ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to individual infantry platoons in both the Army and then later on in the United States Marine Corps. And both of those organizations found great utility in providing that ISR down to the platoon level. And they started to realize that intelligent small UASs, or ones that were much easier to fly, ones that did not have a huge burden of pilot training, et cetera, were even better. And because in addition to providing accurate and timely intelligence, which is of supreme importance, they found that really, really reduced the training cost, and more importantly, most importantly, in my view, reduced the cognitive burden on the operators. And this essentially allowed them to democratize the use of small UAS to not just a small group of highly trained pilots, but to democratize it down to multiple users who perhaps had never even thought about using a drone before. And this allowed soldiers to focus on the fight and not the flight. And that's a very important. And we actually saw this in the manned aviation space as well. I flew the F-16, and over time, we would add more and more automation to the airplane. And every time we did that, I was able to take my limited gray matter, which gets more limited every day, and focus it on the higher order tasks instead of maybe some administrative tasks of checking fuel and checking engine gauges. It allowed me to focus on the tactics and get notifications when those negative things were starting to happen. And so we're seeing the same transition at a more rapid pace in the small UAS space. So these programs led to what the United States Army calls their short-range reconnaissance program, and the Marine Corps calls their short-range short endurance program. And we at Skydio actually are honored to be the program of record holder on both of those. And we've been consistently iterating with the Army on new improvements to those vehicles. And I'll get to those more in a minute. But then all of a sudden in 2022, everything changed. And the major change that happened there is we saw Russia illegally invade Ukraine. And while many, many military strategists gave the Ukrainians a slim chance of surviving even the month, I think you all know the rest of the story. And I can confirm, because I was over there last week, and with my own eyes, I can tell you that not only did the Ukrainians survive that month, but they are still fighting and still protecting their nation to this day. And a major reason for their success thus far has been the adoption of that small, mini, and agile strategy I was describing before. And ultimately, I think the Ukrainians and also the rest of the world have learned from that conflict so far that drones aren't just something that's nice to have and might provide a little bit of better information here, better information there. But they found that in addition to being a tactical, nice thing, they become actually a strategic imperative that can ultimately tip the scales of war. And I think we can prove that that is true by how the Russians reacted to the use of Ukrainian small UAS. And the way the Russians reacted is they invested a lot of time and a lot of money into creating counters to the Ukrainians' new benefit of small UAS. And the way they chose to counter it was to use electronic warfare. And that started out initially as jamming the global navigation satellite signals, or GPS, to confuse drones so they couldn't get where they needed to be. But then later, also jamming the radio links between the controllers and the drones. And this was all in an effort to deny the Ukrainians that advantage that they have gotten. And it worked because, and there are various reports on this, I think the last reports that I saw is the electronic warfare is so potent in Ukraine right now. The Ukrainians are losing roughly 10,000 drones per month. And so if you thought about that and losing 10,000 predators a month, it would just be amazing. But they're still losing a lot of drones, which leads me to this discussion of what are some of the innovations that are happening to counter that. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the future in this industry. So some of the major innovations that I think we have learned from the battlefield, as well as our commercial customers, and that we're trying to apply and put into the drones so that they can serve humans better, starts with autonomous technology. So autonomy in Skydio drones, at least, manifests in several different ways. The first is in something we call obstacle avoidance. So the vehicles themselves have multiple fisheye cameras and are also loaded up. There are multiple neural networks running on the drone itself. And this allows the drone to understand where it is, have a visual understanding of where it is. And now with the X10, that visual understanding is at both day and at night. And that understanding allows the drone to avoid obstacles. So as an operator, you have to focus less on avoiding the tree or avoiding hitting the ground or a building, and you can focus on accomplishing the mission, and that is getting the drone from point A to point B. So you can take the sticks and run full forward at a tree, and the drone will just fly around it. And I'd love to say that they are 100% uncrashable. Unfortunately, sometimes bad things still happen, but it happens very, very infrequently. So the obstacle avoidance is very important, and that leads to that democratization to where instead of having a highly trained, fleet of drone operators or drone pilots, we can have a much larger swath of that military community fly those drones. The next thing is we're able to put classification algorithms running at the edge on the drone so that the drone can identify or at least classify, say, a vehicle or a person, and now be able to track that individual and stay with them without a human touching the sticks, the throttles, what have you. And again, this is another important feature to allow humans to direct the drone to do something and then take their hands off and focus more on the broader topic. Another nuance of this is something that we call Scout that is available in our drones. And the Scout feature essentially allows the drones, or a few of them, to mimic a convoy movement. So if you're driving in a small convoy of, say, Humvees, the drone knows where, using its computer vision and radio links, knows where that convoy is and can follow it and essentially sweep out in front of and behind that convoy to create a 360-degree bubble of situational awareness to keep soldiers safe. And again, all of this allows soldiers to focus on their mission and not flying a drone, which all of those things allow a much greater operational effectiveness and allows us to continue innovating. So I'm going to leave that subject and kind of get to what I think is the future of the UAS market. And then I'd like to take some questions. So when I look at the future, first off, I see, especially in the tactical ISR use case, supporting defense customers to understand their environment, what's over the hill, that age-old military question, is I see a greater proliferation of drones across the space. Whereas right now, for instance, the US Army has fielded the systems at the platoon level, which is roughly one drone per 40 people. We see that proliferating across perhaps down to the squad level, which is roughly one drone for every 8 people, and one day perhaps being at one drone per individual. So that proliferation is important, and there you can see why that need for democratizing the use, making them so easy to fly that anyone can do it, is so important, because now each individual would have the benefits available of that ISR asset for them. So, I think that is incredibly important. But when I look even a little bit further out, based on some of the things we have learned as a dual use company from our commercial and our public safety customers, I think that tactical ISR use case is literally just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot more ice under the waterline than there is sitting on top. And so some of those areas where I think we're going to see continued innovation, and we need to see continued innovation because it will help with readiness and therefore help with this idea of deterrence, starts with infrastructure inspections. So in the commercial space, we see many customers using our drones to perform autonomous or at least human-assisted inspections of bridges, roads, buildings, electrical infrastructure, such as towers and substations, warehouses, etc. And this is important because now these inspections can be accomplished much more rapidly, much more efficiently, at a much lower cost, and importantly for a military context, with a much lower use of fuel, which is a huge burden in a military context. Also, these defense assets, whether they're airplanes, ships, tanks, or vehicles, or the infrastructure such as runways, towers, et cetera. The military has all of those things, and it's very analogous to what we're seeing in the public sector. And as the U.S. military and allied military start to build these inspections and do them autonomously, they can start to build heuristics of digital twins, observe those changes over the time, and now start to get to a point where we can really start to do predictive maintenance, which is something that I had the honor of focusing on at another company through vast amounts of data. Another area is streamlining global supply chains. There's an old adage in military parlance, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it basically says that rookies focus on tactics, but experts focus on logistics. So the U.S. military moves vast quantities of things over vast distances and is really a strategic benefit to the United States of America and the allies as well. So building upon the knowledge that we have gained at Skydio from some of our commercial partners on how they were using drones to do everything from scanning the inside of a warehouse to gain in-transit visibility on the boxes by scanning the UPC codes autonomously at night or on command is super important. Also, as we're seeing in our public safety world, as well as some of the commercial businesses that we work with, using drones to amplify or augment humans in securing a facility or a location. So much like, there are police forces right now that are starting to use drones to secure, say, a large venue for the Super Bowl, if you will. Military bases look much like that, and there's an opportunity to use drones to supplement human security forces or military police to do those things. This is an important part of the U.S. Military strategic requirement as well, because as we start to look at dispersing assets, those assets must be protected. And quite frankly, there aren't enough humans to go to all those dispersed places and perform the security needed. So being able to use a drone to do so autonomously, or at least to amplify the humans that are there, is an important part of achieving strategic deterrence. And then finally, and then I want to get to questions, in the future, and we're kind of on the leading edge of this right now, is developing multi-drone collaborative tactics. And by this, I mean multiple drones working together to accomplish a goal. And this is more than just a drone light show, which typically those are pre-programmed efforts where every drone knows exactly where it's going to go before they all launch. And they look like they're acting together, but they're really not. They're each performing a pre-planned event, and they just happen to be pre-planned together. So true multi-drone collaborative tactics are where we take the intent of a single human or small group of humans and distribute that intent to multiple intelligent flying robots. And by the way, this is why we call them that and not drones. And now having each of those individual flying robots determine what part of the intent it can accomplish, and then working and communicating with the other drones to make that happen. And the beauty of this over, say, the pre-programmed drone light show is that if one drone fails, other drones can now reason in real time, see how they can pick up that mission. Or if the scenario changes, the drones can understand, I still know the intent, and even though the scenario has changed, I might have to change how I do it, but I'm still going to focus on achieving that intent. And I think this is of supreme importance to the US and the allied militaries, because when I look at the concept that many of the US Department of Defense leaders have communicated in the form of the Replicator Initiative, where they state the need for vast quantities of autonomous, intelligent, and intrusible unmanned aerial systems, I think we're going to have to move to a point where we have these multi-drone collaborative tactics. Because at the end of the day, the vision that I'm hearing from many US leaders is of a future battlefield with thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of robots, some of which might walk, some might swim, and others are going to fly. But when I think about that battlefield, I don't think we can have the old school control paradigm where there's a single human holding a controller communicating with one drone. I just simply don't think that will scale. If for no other reason, I don't know if there will be enough human hands to hold all the controllers required to make that happen. So in order for that vision to become a reality, and I think that it should, I think it would be more stabilizing and achieve greater deterrence if that were the case. To get there, we must break the one-to-one control paradigm and get to a one-to-many situation. Because if we don't do that, then again, I think we're going to continue in this deterrence failure loop. So I guess I'm going to end this prepared remarks session where I started, and kind of this summary vision that I painted for you ultimately looks like sensors everywhere, connected to everything, and then informing everyone. So I appreciate your time and attention through those prepared remarks. Hopefully they made sense. But now I'd love to take some questions. So Shannon, I don't know if you've gotten any questions yet, but if you do, let's jump into those.
Absolutely. We do have a couple coming in. And just as a reminder, attendees, please submit your questions clicking that Q&A button at the bottom. But yes, we've got a good chunk of time to dive into these. So the first question that we have so far is how do the Skydio drones integrate with existing military communication systems in order to help enhance the coordination during these operations?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And it actually is, we could probably do a whole webinar just on that because it gets highly technical. So I will try to stay at the summary level. And if someone needs to dive deeper, please give us a shout and we're happy to go deeper. But at a high level at Skydio, we always attempt to maintain what we call a modular open system architecture, where, again, my opening line, sensors everywhere connected to everything. So the connection piece is really important. So the way that manifests primarily in the defense space is being able to connect through the most widely used tactical interface, and that is ATAC, or the Android Tactical Assault Kit. And so in addition to that, there are several other government communications standards, is probably the best way to put them. One's called RAS-A, which is the aerial version of the robotics system. It's essentially a communications protocol. So we have been communicating and working with that community to further develop RAS-A to make it even more robust. And then finally, many of our commercial drones are connected through 5G so that they can do robust remote operations anywhere in the world. Like literally, if we could work the cameras, I could get on my laptop right now, and I'm in the southeastern part of the United States today, but I could fly drones in California on my screen just through my keyboard. So we have lots of commercial customers doing that today. Many military customers are not yet doing that, but if you look at some of the other things that they're looking at deployable private 5G networks at the forward edge of the battlefield. And so we were working with them to start using some of these more open 5G type connectivity pieces so they can also take advantage of those capabilities.
Impressive. Thank you. So the next question, you actually talked about being over in the Ukraine and seeing firsthand something. So a question sort of related to that, how has the feedback from these frontline operators influenced the evolution of Skydio drones, the design, the functionalities, and the work you guys are putting into them?
Yeah, so I mean, broadly speaking, so not just Skydio, but kind of the small UAS space in general, I think what we've learned from what's going on in Ukraine is that you can't just look at one use case and think that all drones are going to do that one thing. And while it's great to create a jack of all trades, or a Swiss Army knife of drones, if you will, what we're seeing in Ukraine is some real frontline innovation where their soldiers are breaking out soldering irons and reconfiguring drones and making them right there on the front line for very, very purpose-specific type items. So in a more specific context with Skydio, we've had teams, I think this was our 17th trip to Ukraine in the last, I think, 17-ish months. So it's happening quite frequently. And so we've tried to create a rapid feedback loop. And most of the learnings that we've obtained are around how to counter the Russian countermeasures, which are primarily EW, or electronic warfare, or what they call radio electronic combat. And so some of the things that we have focused on are making our data link between the controller and the vehicle more robust. We've started recently, we released a frequency hopping radio so that we can avoid where things are being jammed. And also, we've done many, many software updates to improve our AI. And this is where we think the real leapfrog opportunity is, because electronic warfare it's always been a cat and mouse game where someone develops capability, someone develops a counter, and you just end up in this ratcheting effect. And so we have been trying to find ways to leapfrog that so that it would take a longer time to catch up. And we think AI is the answer to that. So some of the ways that we've started to use software to make the AI better to counter the GPS jamming is to start using more and more visual navigation. So in addition to the cameras on the drone, as I said, being used for obstacle avoidance, they also understand where they are in the environment. And you can almost, it's not technically perfect to say this, but you can almost think of the drone as throwing down little visual breadcrumbs as it starts to execute its mission. And if it does lose all contact with the controller through the radio frequency link or to GPS through that link, now the drone can actually navigate home using those breadcrumbs that it's done visually so that the operator can gain the insights that that drone has found. And this is important not just for military operations. We see this happen a lot in the commercial space, especially for customers that are operating in dense urban environments. There's a condition called the urban canyon where GPS signals will bounce around which for those who don't know, GPS signals are really just very, very accurate timing signals. But as they bounce around off the building to the road to another building, that creates a time delay. And so it really, really confuses GPS receivers so they don't know where they are. And so this is another area where that visual breadcrumb capability using AI is of extreme importance, even outside of a military context. So the short answer to your question, those are the kind of things that we're working on. But I'll tell you, it's hard. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of dedication to continuously maintain that connection with end customers.
I can only imagine. Absolutely. We've got a couple questions that have come in around the Replicator program. So I was wondering if you could just sort of share your overall thoughts and how Skydio approaches that concept.
You bet. So I'll start with this. First, I don't call Replicator a program. Program in the US Department of Defense terminology is a very specific thing. It means congressional authorization, congressionally appropriated funds, a program office who's running a very detailed program. And I don't think that is Replicator yet. So when I think of Replicator, I think about it as a strategic concept and one that is actually quite necessary. So I think this started with Dr. Kathleen Hicks, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I believe last October, she was at an event and released this idea of, and again, this kind of goes back to that small, mini, and agile hedging strategy that I talked about in the opening remarks, but recognizing the need to deter a country that has, 4 times the people we have. They're highly invested in technology. Many of their technology capabilities are onshored within their own economy. And to contrast that with, we have long supply chains, many of the especially important things that we need for computer chips, batteries, rare earth minerals, et cetera, we often have to import. This creates a strategic brittleness. So recognizing that we need to invest up front in what she called a vast quantity of small, attritable, and autonomous systems so that we could essentially demonstrate that, hey, you don't want to take an aggressive action, because if you do, we will A, know about it, and B, be able to respond to it. And you will not gain what you think you might gain. And so to do that, again, leaning back on that small, mini, agile strategy. So at a high level, I think that's what Replicator is. What it means to us at Skydio, I think, is it is a validation of our foundational thesis that created this company. And that is that if you can make small UAS easy to operate so that it didn't take huge quantities of training, vast amounts of time, and make them useful to people through autonomy, AI, et cetera, then there would be a wide group of people who never thought about using drones that will start to use them. And so in many ways, I see this idea or this strategic concept that many are calling Replicator as a validation of what we have started and what we continue to do at Skydio.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
And kind of bridging on to Replicator and the impact that this technology can have in military operations. The question is asking, in what ways are the Skydio drones contributing to minimizing that collateral damage and protecting civilian lives during these operations?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So when I talked about what I called the tactical ISR, or again, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance use case, That is probably the most widely used use case that we see in the defense world. And in addition to looking over the hill and understanding what's there, which again has been a problem since Sun Tzu has been writing about military history, many of these drones are also being used to identify, okay, this is an enemy target, and to be able to know what is around that enemy target. And right there, the ability to minimize collateral damage is important. But also we have a highly accurate sensing capability and can get highly accurate coordinates so that we're communicating the most accurate information back to battlefield commanders, which does a tremendous job of minimizing the potential for damage to non-combatants. And that's, I think, of critical importance as well. And we're seeing that around the world, because if you want to deter, you have to demonstrate the ability to, prevent the enemy from achieving their action. And sometimes the enemy actually wants collateral damage. So to be able to prevent that from happening is an important part of deterring in the future.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm looking, we're kind of nearing the end of our list. So one more plug, audience. If you have additional questions that you want to get to before we close out for today, go ahead and type them in and submit them now, and we'll get them in our queue. But we do have another question, and it's kind of that forward looking, like you were mentioning towards the end of your presentation. How is Skydio kind of planning to address the challenges of these evolving threats and counter drone technologies in maintaining their operational superiority?
Yeah, you bet. So again, you can tell that drones are being successful because nations and militaries are developing counter drone technologies. If drones were not having an effect, people would not be wasting money or time on counter drone technologies. So that's your number one proof point that drones are actually of strategic importance. So those counter drone technologies are roughly, at least in my view, broken down into two things. There are kinetic counter drone capabilities, which would be missiles, net, even a baseball bat, right? You could, in theory, knock a drone out of the sky if it got closer to you or close enough to you with a baseball bat. And then there are non-kinetic capabilities. And most of those are in that electronic warfare domain that I talked about earlier. And I talked mostly about radio frequency jamming and global navigation or GPS jamming, but there also could be directed energy in the form of lasers and things like that. So again, the most efficacious way we are looking at addressing those challenges, keeping our drones airborne and making them more robust and more resilient, is the dual approach, number one, of creating better radios that have the ability to hop around and avoid that RF jamming, wider spectrum, et cetera, but also leapfrogging with our artificial intelligence to get to a point where you don't need a radio link and you don't need a GPS signal, that drone can, with its own visual navigation system, accomplish the mission from start to finish. And we've demonstrated great progress towards that in our most recent trip to Ukraine in actual real world jamming conditions. It's quite impressive to see. So that's where we are mostly focused today. And we believe that focus on the AI and the software piece is probably the most critical, because in addition to solving today's problem, when something is software defined, now you can iterate on that so much more rapidly. And this is where there's a famous, well, I don't know if he's famous to everyone, but he's famous in the old fighter pilot community, a gentleman named John Boyd. And he was the one that was credited with creating this idea of an OODA loop, or observe, orient, decide, and attack. And the basic thesis there was the faster someone can gather information coming in, recognize what it is, gaining situational awareness, and then acting on that information, that is going to be the most important thing in the long run to strategic success. And so we see that as being software defined, excuse me. And that's why our radios are software defined. So as we see new techniques come out there, well, we should have the ability to rapidly innovate and get that out in days or weeks, rather than, okay, we have to go rebuild a new radio with new cameras and a new drone, and that might take 6 months to a year. And we think that is the secret to tightening the OODA loop up and surviving in that contested environment.
Perfect. Thank you. We did get another question that came in, sort of shifting out of military, but more into the public safety domain, in talking about using Skydio products with public safety programs. And so it's kind of addressing the idea of the cost differences and support for that. Would you see a federal program to allow greater use of blue listed UAVs, or any insight into kind of your thoughts of what about around that difference that could help support public safety to utilize Skydio drones?
So I recognize that probably the price at the point of sale for some of our drones might look higher, but I would encourage everyone to look at the total cost of ownership before making a decision. And what I mean by that is if you buy Drone X, which doesn't have some of the autonomous features that I'm talking about, and you crash them at a certain rate, which is way higher than you would crash ours, I think you would see relatively quickly that cost delta would even out. So that's one thing I would encourage folks to do instead of just looking at, okay, here's when I go to the website, here's the price I see, because that doesn't tell the full story. The next thing is, I recognize that there are there's legislation out there like I think countering or the American Security Drone Act is one of them, and I think there's another effort called countering CCP drones, and I recognize that those are placing restrictions on using Chinese-made drones in a commercial or defense or government context, whether that's state and local government or national government. And I recognize there's some concern that people have that perhaps we're disturbing the market, or that those pieces of legislation are disturbing the market. But I would encourage people to go and read the CISA or CISA vulnerability assessment that was recently released, that was backed by the FBI. And I think you will find that there are some significant vulnerabilities that legislation seeks to counter. And I think it's important. And it's not unsimilar to what we saw with Huawei a few years back. So I'd encourage people to read that. And then the final piece is, I think, and I can't verify this, maybe someone with a legislative affairs background, but I've heard that with those pieces of legislation, that the United States Congress has developed grant programs that they are going to focus on state and local entities so they can do fleet replacements to replace Chinese-made drones with American-made drones.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that response. So that has gone through our questions right at about the 45-minute mark. So Mark, I'd like to give you an opportunity for any closing comments before I close this out for the afternoon.
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks to AUVSI and Shannon. Thanks to you in particular for hosting this. I really do appreciate it. For those who joined, thank you. I really do appreciate it. Again, I wish I could have seen your faces. It's much easier for me to talk to people when I can look at faces and measure reactions. But for those who had questions that maybe you did not want to ask in front of the whole audience, I'm really easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn, William Mark Valentine. Pretty easy to find. Please reach out. And if there's a question that you did not get asked here, I will do my best to answer it. If I can't, for whatever reason, because I don't have the right brain cells installed for that, I can find the people that can get the question